They thought they could erase me with a forged signature, but when my own son attacked me in my study to steal the real documents, I turned the law and the courts into my weapon. What happened next left him with nothing but shame and scars. Before we dive deeper, don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. My name is Harold Whitmore. I am 71 years old, a retired history teacher who spent 4 decades lecturing about the rise and fall of empires, the forging of nations, and the betrayals that reshaped history. I thought I had studied enough treachery in books to recognize it in the world around me. But nothing in my lectures prepared me for betrayal within my own bloodline. I am also a grandfather of 3. To them, I am simply Grandpa Harold, the man who makes pancakes in funny shapes, who tells bedtime stories about medieval knights, and who slips them dollar bills folded into origami birds. To them, I am safe and steady, the way a grandfather ought to be. But to my son, Gregory, I had become something else entirely, an obstacle. When my wife, Martha, passed away after 49 years of marriage, I thought Gregory would step forward as the protector of our family's name, the bridge between me and the next generation. Instead, he began circling me like a vulture that had caught the scent of a carcass. He came by with polite smiles, carrying folders and pens, saying things like, "Dad, let me help you with the paperwork," or, "You should not be dealing with all these estate details alone." His wife, Emily, always stood a step behind him, silent but watchful, like a shadow with intentions of her own. I pretended not to notice at first. I wanted to believe the best. After all, this was the boy I'd raised, the boy who used to sit at the kitchen table while I graded essays, asking me to explain the difference between a republic and a democracy. I wanted to believe his help came from love, not calculation. But the first warning arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, inside a stiff envelope from the county clerk's office. I sat at my oak desk, the same desk where Martha once wrote her grocery lists and birthday cards, and slit open the envelope with a letter opener that had belonged to my father. The paper inside crackled like dry leaves. My eyes skimmed the words once, then twice, before the meaning slammed into me like a hammer. According to official records, I had already sold my farmhouse to Gregory and his wife. The farmhouse. The one Martha and I bought when I was 30, with her savings from nursing and my meager teacher's salary combined. The house where we raised Gregory. The land where we planted an orchard together, where Martha pressed wildflowers into thick books, and where we buried our old retriever beneath the apple tree. The deed transfer showed my name, written neatly at the bottom. The signature was confident, practiced, familiar. Too familiar. My hand, but not my hand. I sat frozen, staring at the forged scrawl. It was my name, but not my soul. A wave of nausea rolled through me as I set the paper down. My son had done this. My only child. And for the first time in my life, I understood how history's kings must have felt when their heirs sharpened knives in the dark. I whispered into the silence of the study, "Martha, what has he become?" And the house, empty now of her laughter, gave no answer. I drove straight to my attorney's office that afternoon, the letter from the county clerk folded so many times in my pocket it had become soft as cloth. My hands shook on the steering wheel the entire way. I had graded thousands of forged essays in my teaching career, sloppy attempts by students trying to cover up copied paragraphs, but nothing had ever hit me like this. This was no high school plagiarism. This was my life, my home, my past. Samuel Pierce, my attorney for over 30 years, adjusted his reading glasses and studied the letter in silence for several long minutes. His office smelled of leather and coffee, the same as it always had, but I couldn't sit still. I paced in front of his bookshelves, filled with neat rows of law tomes that suddenly seemed to tower like gravestones. Finally, Samuel set the paper down, leaned back in his chair, and released a long, tired sigh. "Harold," he said, voice heavy, "this is a forgery. A bad one, to anyone who knows you. But it is good enough to cause trouble." "Forged?" I whispered, though I had already known it in my gut. He nodded, tapping the signature with one finger. "This was not written by you. But it was written by someone who has studied your hand. Someone who had access to documents you signed." He gave me a long, meaningful look. "Harold, this was your son." The words knocked the air from my chest. I had taught Gregory how to write his own name, how to curl his letters clean and clear. And now that same hand had betrayed me. My son, my only child, had not just reached for my possessions. He had tried to erase me, to pretend I no longer existed. I sank into the chair opposite Samuel's desk, staring at the neat lines of my forged name. It was almost perfect. Almost. I felt my face drain of color, my bones suddenly hollow. Samuel cleared his throat. "We'll file an injunction immediately. That will freeze any transfer of property. You'll also need certified copies of the original deeds, with county seals. Once you have those, no forged document will stand in court." I nodded mutely, as though I were back in one of my own classrooms, listening to a lecture I could barely absorb. "Harold," he added softly, "this is war. Your son has declared it. You must be ready to fight back." That night, after securing the certified documents, I placed them in my old steel safe, the one Martha used to tease me about, saying it belonged in a bank vault rather than a farmhouse study. My hands lingered on the combination lock longer than necessary. I had guarded student records, savings, Martha's jewelry, but never before had I locked away my very right to exist in my own home. The next morning, Gregory came by unannounced. He carried a cup of coffee from the gas station down the road, acting casual, almost cheerful. "Morning, Dad," he said, strolling into the kitchen without knocking. "You look tired. Not sleeping well?" I studied his face. His eyes darted to the hall that led toward my study before he even sat down. "I got a letter," I said evenly. His smile froze, just for a flicker of a second, before it returned. "A letter?" "From the county clerk," I continued. "It says I sold the farmhouse." The silence stretched. Gregory stirred his coffee, though he hadn't added sugar or cream. The spoon clinked far too loudly against the paper cup. Finally, he chuckled, a brittle, forced sound. "Bureaucrats. You know how paperwork gets mixed up. Someone must have filed something wrong." "Someone," I repeated softly, my eyes fixed on him. For a moment, the boy I had raised vanished, and what sat across from me was a stranger wearing my son's face. "I've already spoken to my attorney," I said. "Everything is frozen now. Permanently." His jaw tightened, but he forced another smile. "Dad, you don't need to drag lawyers into this. You know I just want to help manage things." "Help," I said, leaning forward, my voice low. "You tried to steal my house while I'm still alive." His face hardened, the mask slipping. For a moment, I thought he might say something truly honest. Instead, he stood, muttered something about needing to get to work, and left the half-full cup of coffee sweating on my kitchen table. When the door closed, the house seemed to exhale. But I sat in the silence knowing one thing with perfect clarity: Gregory would be back. And the next time, he would not come smiling. That was when things turned dangerous. 2 nights later, I sat alone in my study, the lamplight casting long shadows across the walls lined with Martha's books and framed photographs of our family. On the desk before me lay a small velvet box of medals, my father's from the Second World War, mine from a brief stint in Vietnam, all destined for my grandson someday. I had been turning them over in my hands, reminding myself that honor was something you earned, not something you stole. The house was quiet, too quiet. I had grown used to silence since Martha's passing, but that night, it pressed in on me differently. It was the kind of silence that warns of a storm. Then I heard it. The unmistakable, dragging creak of the back door's hinges. My heart lurched. That door was always locked. Always. Before I could even rise from my chair, heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway. And then Gregory burst into my study like a man possessed. His eyes were bloodshot, wild, his shirt untucked and his face shining with sweat. He reeked of whiskey so strongly it stung my nose. "Where are they?" he bellowed, slamming the door behind him. I barely had time to respond before he jabbed a shaking finger toward the safe tucked into the corner of the study. "Just hand me the papers, Dad. They're mine anyway." I opened my mouth to speak, but Gregory didn't wait. He lunged across the desk, scattering the medals onto the floor. His hands gripped my shoulders with a strength I didn't know he had, and before I could brace myself, he shoved me back against the wall. The impact rattled my bones, pain shooting through my ribs as I gasped for air. At 71, I am not the man I once was. My knees buckled, my arms strained to push him back, but years of wear and age are merciless opponents. For a moment, I truly thought he might break me. But I had one advantage, foreknowledge. Weeks earlier, when I first suspected Gregory's intentions, I had installed a small hidden camera in the corner of the study, tucked neatly into the spine of an old atlas. Every word, every strike, every ounce of his fury was being recorded in crisp, undeniable clarity. "Open it," he roared, slamming me again against the plaster. "Open the safe, old man." His fists trembled, not with fear, but with the desperation of someone who has staked everything on a single reckless gamble. His face hovered inches from mine, the veins in his neck bulging, spittle flying as he shouted. I stared at him, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose nightmares I had soothed when he was small. And yet in that moment, there was nothing of my son left in him. He looked more like a cornered animal than a man. "I will not open it," I said, my voice low, steady, though my heart thundered in my chest. He froze for half a second, as if the firmness in my tone shocked him. Then he let out a growl, a sound I had never heard from him before, and shoved me once more before pulling back. His hands balled into fists, but he didn't strike. Perhaps some small sliver of the boy he had been still lingered, restraining him. He backed away slowly, muttering under his breath, eyes darting wildly toward the safe one last time. Then, with a sudden violent motion, he slammed the study door so hard the walls shook. The house fell silent again. Silent except for the ragged sound of my own breathing. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, surrounded by scattered metals that glimmered faintly in the lamplight. My ribs ached, my arms trembled, and yet all I could think was, he would have taken everything if I hadn't been ready. He had left me bruised, but alive. And, though he didn't know it yet, already defeated, because I had captured every second of his attack on film. When the door slammed shut and the house finally went quiet, I slid down the wall and sat there on the floor, clutching my side. The ache in my ribs spread like fire every time I drew in a breath. My hands trembled so badly I could barely gather the scattered metals. For a long moment, I simply sat in the dim glow of the desk lamp, staring at the war decorations that seemed to mock me now. Bravery, honor, sacrifice, all words from another age. What did they mean when your own son was the enemy? I tried to stand, but the room tilted. My chest felt tight, my vision blurred at the edges. Something inside me whispered that this was more than just bruises. At 71, every fall, every blow, carries weight. I reached for the phone on the desk, my fingers clumsy, and dialed the only number I could trust. The ride in the ambulance was a blur of flashing lights and muffled questions. A young paramedic pressed a stethoscope to my chest and muttered something about arrhythmia. His voice faded in and out, like he was underwater. I clutched the folded envelope still in my jacket pocket, the county's letter, proof of Gregory's betrayal, because I refused to let go of it, not even on a gurney. When I woke again, it was to the antiseptic bite of a hospital room. The ceiling tiles above me were stark white, the kind I had stared at once before when Martha lay in the next bed, her life slipping away. Now it was me lying here, monitors beeping, for dripping, ribs bound tight with gauze. The doctor, a woman with sharp eyes softened by kindness, stood at my bedside. "Mr. Whitmore, you've suffered 2 cracked ribs, likely from a blunt impact. But what worries us more is the stress it's put on your heart. Your blood pressure spiked dangerously high." Another incident like this, she paused, letting the silence finish her sentence. I nodded faintly, the weight of her words pressing down harder than the bandages. And then the nurse stepped aside, and I saw my daughter-in-law Emily in the doorway. She wore her usual mask of concern, hands folded neatly over her handbag. "Oh, Harold," she said, as if reading from a script. "What happened?" I stared at her, searching for even a flicker of genuine worry, but found none. Only calculation, the same cold steel I had seen in Gregory's eyes 2 nights ago. I slipped, I lied, voice raspy. "But you and I both know why I'm here." For the first time, a crack showed in her composure. She tightened her grip on the handbag and stepped back. "You should rest," she said quickly, before vanishing down the hall. When the room grew quiet again, I let out a shaky breath. My body was battered, my heart unsteady, but my mind had never been clearer. Gregory had nearly broken me, but in trying, he had also handed me the final weapon. Because the camera in my study had captured everything. And once I walked out of this hospital, I would take that evidence straight into court. 3 days later, I left the hospital with my ribs bound and a packet of prescriptions in my coat pocket. The orderly wheeled me through the sliding glass doors, but I insisted on standing as I stepped out into the cold air. My body was slower, weaker, but inside I carried something harder than bone, resolve. The drive back to the farmhouse felt different this time. The familiar oak trees that lined the gravel road no longer looked like guardians of peace, but silent witnesses to betrayal. I unlocked the front door and paused in the entryway, listening. No creak of footsteps, no drunken voice demanding I open the safe. Just the quiet hum of the furnace. Safe, for now. I went straight to the study. My hand still trembled as I reached behind the row of atlases and retrieved the small hidden camera. I sat at my desk, plugged it into the old computer, and watched. There it was, every second captured in cold, unblinking clarity. Gregory's face twisted with rage, his voice breaking as he shouted at me. His hands shoving me into the wall. My refusal, calm but unyielding. His retreat, full of fury. I watched it 3 times, each viewing carving something deeper into me. The first time, I flinched as if reliving the blows. The second, I studied his expression, my son, but not my son. The third, I stopped feeling anything at all. Only certainty. There was no other path. I thought of Martha, her voice in the kitchen years ago, "Harold, always choose forgiveness when you can." She had believed in second chances, in mercy. But mercy, I realized, is wasted on those who wield cruelty like a blade. Forgiveness could not rebuild trust. Forgiveness could not protect the farmhouse, the orchard, the meadows, or the future of my grandchildren. Forgiveness would only arm Gregory with another opportunity to strike. Justice was the only thing left. It wasn't vengeance for my bruised ribs or the sleepless nights. It wasn't even about the insult of forged signatures. It was about the truth, about standing in a courtroom and saying, "Here is what he did. Here is who he has become." Because if I stayed silent, if I looked the other way, then Gregory would not stop with me. He would come again, more desperate, more dangerous. And one day, it might not be me who suffered, it might be those children, the only innocent ones left in this mess. I opened a fresh folder on my desk, labeling it with careful, steady handwriting, "Evidence." Inside went the county's letter, the certified deeds, and now the footage. A lifetime as a teacher had taught me to build cases, to present facts clearly and without embellishment. This would be no different. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. My son had tried to erase me with lies and violence. But I would answer with the law, with truth, with the cold weight of justice. And when the gavel finally fell, he would learn that betrayal carries a price no amount of whiskey or forged ink can pay. The morning of the hearing, I dressed slowly, my ribs still aching with every twist and turn. I buttoned my best gray suit, the same one I had worn to Martha's funeral, and knotted the dark blue tie she had once called my battle flag. My hands shook as I did it, not from weakness, but from the enormity of what lay ahead. The drive to the courthouse was quiet, just the hum of the tires against the asphalt and the low wheeze of the heater. The town passed by in a blur, the diner where Martha and I used to drink coffee on Saturday mornings, the hardware store where I'd bought the safe that now held the documents, the park where I'd taught Gregory to ride a bicycle without training wheels. Every place felt heavy with memory, every turn a reminder of what was at stake. I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. An old man, yes, but not a broken one. My eyes were sunken, my skin lined, but somewhere inside those features I still recognized the man who once stood in front of classrooms full of restless students, demanding they know the truth of history. Today, the lesson would be for Gregory. I thought of Martha again, and the words she whispered on her deathbed, "Take care of him." I had failed that request in ways she could never have imagined. But maybe, I told myself, what I was about to do was taking care of him, forcing him to face the man he had become. Sometimes justice is the only form of love left. The courthouse rose ahead, a squat building of pale stone, unremarkable to most but to me it might as well have been a fortress. I parked, gathered the thick folder marked evidence, and walked slowly toward the doors, cane in one hand, resolve in the other. Inside, the courtroom was already buzzing when I entered. Gregory sat at the defendant's table, hair slicked back, a practiced look of indifference on his face. Emily was beside him, clutching his arm like a lifeline, her eyes darting toward me with a mixture of contempt and fear. I met Gregory's eyes. For the briefest moment, I saw something there, perhaps shame, perhaps rage, perhaps nothing at all. He quickly looked away. The judge entered. We all rose. The trial began. My attorney, Samuel, wasted no time. He laid out the forged documents, the forged signature, the county clerk's testimony. And then, with a click of the remote, the hidden camera footage filled the courtroom screen. There was Gregory, storming into my study, reeking of alcohol, his face twisted with desperation. There was his voice, raw and unrestrained, "Just hand me the papers, Dad. They're mine anyway." There was the shove, the impact, my body crumpling against the wall. The room went silent except for the crackling audio of my refusal. "I will not open it." I looked across the room at my son as the footage played. His face drained of color, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might break. Emily's hand slipped from his arm. The judge's gavel came down hard, the sound echoing like thunder. "This court finds Gregory Whitmore guilty of fraud, forgery, and assault." Her voice was steady, absolute. "The deeds are invalid. The property remains the rightful possession of Mr. Harold Whitmore. Sentencing will follow." It was over. Gregory's head dropped into his hands, his body shaking, not with remorse, but with fury at having been caught. He looked up at me once more, and for the first time in years, I felt no obligation to soften my gaze. He was my son, yes, but in that moment, he was also the architect of his own downfall. As the bailiff led him away, I rose carefully to my feet. My ribs ached, my knees protested, but I stood tall. Justice had not healed the wound he left in me, but it had closed it. And as I walked out of that courthouse into the sharp winter air, I whispered to Martha, as if she were beside me again. "He will not take this home from us. Not now. Not ever." The final sentencing came 3 weeks later. By then, word had spread through town like wildfire. People who once waved politely at Gregory now crossed the street to avoid him. His clients at the insurance firm vanished overnight, leaving him jobless before the gavel even fell. Emily had already moved out, taking the children to her mother's house. But none of that compared to what happened in the courtroom that morning. Gregory stood before the judge, his suit wrinkled, his eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. For the first time, he looked smaller than me, not by age, but by the weight of shame. The judge's words rang out like iron: "Forgery, fraud, and assault on an elder are not just crimes against the law. They are crimes against trust. You tried to erase your own father. You nearly cost him his home, his safety, and his life. For these offenses, this court sentences you to 3 years in state prison, with additional restitution owed for damages." The bailiff stepped forward. The clink of handcuffs closing around Gregory's wrists was sharper than any gavel strike. I watched as my son, my boy who once built model airplanes with me at this very farmhouse, was led away, chains at his ankles. He didn't look back. The newspapers ran the story the next day: "Local man sentenced for forging father's deeds and assault." They printed his mugshot, eyes red, jaw clenched, a man undone by his own greed. Neighbors clipped the article, whispered about it at church, and shook their heads. Justice had not restored Gregory to me, nothing could. But it had restored my dignity, my home, my peace. I placed the court's stamped decree in the safe beside the deeds, locking it with a final click. Not out of fear anymore, but out of certainty. The farmhouse would remain in my name until the day I chose otherwise. Later, my granddaughter Emily, named after her mother but untouched by her cruelty, sat with me at the kitchen table, swinging her legs as she colored with crayons. She looked up at me with wide eyes and asked, "Grandpa, is Daddy coming home soon?" I swallowed hard. "Not for a while, sweetheart. But he'll learn some lessons he should have learned a long time ago." And as her crayon scratched across the paper, I thought to myself, lessons written not in ink, but in the cold, hard language of justice. The hammer had fallen. And this time, it had fallen exactly where it belonged.
Hello everyone, and thank you for watching. I truly hope you enjoyed listening to this story as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel to help support the creation of more stories like this. Have a great day or evening.